Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of the Beyond the Lens video podcast. Today we're coming from my studio in Beacon, New York, and on an upcoming episode I'm hoping to give you a little behind the scenes tour of my studio and some of the gear and equipment that I have here and how I use it in my on a day-to-day basis in my photography. So look for that coming up pretty soon. Today we're going to be doing another Lightroom creative workflow, and I call it creative workflow because I really want to emphasize and share the creative decisions that go into interpreting your images in Lightroom. Instead of just pushing knobs and seeing sort of what happens, really have a sense of what you want to bring across in your print, what you want to say, and then approaching the processing with that mindset. I've chosen an image called Lakey's Head, which is an image I made on a recent trip to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia is just a fantastic location for landscape photography. If you like rugged coastline, pink granite cliffs, the ocean, rolling valleys and hills, dramatic weather and light, Cape Breton has all of these things in abundance. And it was really a great experience for me, and I'm hoping to lead a workshop there in 2012. The image is called Lakey's Head, and I've gone ahead and made a print of the image just as I process it in Lightroom, and you'll be seeing on the tutorial. And typically I will print black and white images on a fiber-based paper for richer blacks and shadows, but in this case I've used a matte-based paper because I really just like the way it came out. It just really prints beautifully on this paper. This is Canson Edition Etching 310 paper, and it just feels really nice to the touch. This image is also a part of my portfolio, and so customers and others will actually handle these prints in hand, and I think that the feel really makes an impact when people are viewing the prints. So the other thing is that many of the things that I mentioned in the tutorial having to do with how I want to interpret the image, this is where I really tell whether I'm on the right track or not, when I make a print. And it's not until I actually see and look at it that I know whether I'm on the right track or on the wrong track, or I need to make improvements and changes. So I kind of mentioned that just to encourage you to make prints of your images as well, because it does really make an impact beyond what you see on your computer screen. All right, so again, thanks very much. Enough said. Let's jump into Lightroom and have some fun. So here's my original import of Lakey's Head, Nova Scotia into Lightroom, and as you can see, it's pretty flat, pretty boring, pretty dull. I'm missing the drama and the sort of the mood that the scene had, and again, that's typically what's going to happen when you work with raw files, and I have all of my adjustment settings at 0. The one thing that I do have set here is brightness at 50 and contrast at 25. This sort of gives me just a starting point so that I'm not starting from completely from 0, and this kind of helps with the workflow in terms of going through images when I import them and deciding which ones I want to work with and which ones I don't want to work with. So this we can change, but just a basic starting point. White balance I have set to as shot, basically what my camera thought white balance was, and this is not going to be much of a factor, especially because this image is going to be converted to black and white, sort of how I conceived it and thought of it when I shot it, and so I knew that I wanted to work in black and white. So we're not going to work with that too much. I have turned all the panels off. Again, this image has been processed already, but I've turned the panels off so that we can kind of flow through the tutorial smoothly, and I'll just show you basically the main panels and what they're doing. The adjustments, the basic adjustment panel doesn't have an on-off switch, so I actually have a snapshot with my basic adjustment. So let's select that and turn that on. And so let's see what I've done here. First, I have increased exposure a half stop. That was because I wanted to open up the richer shadows in all of the foreground here. Recovery I have set to 0. You might argue that I could use recovery for the sky here, but no detail here to begin with, number one, and number two, I want to work with this. I'm going to deal with this locally with a local adjustment brush later on, so I don't want to really apply recovery to the other parts of the image that don't need it. Recovery can sometimes dull down your highlights. Fill light is 7 or even 8, and blacks are 8. And a quick tip is typically I like to work with the fill light and blacks together. So whereas I might have my fill light set to 0 and blacks at 5, I might bring the fill light up to 7 or 8, and then I can increase my blacks up to 8. And I find that using them together helps to really define my deep shadows much better than just using blacks alone. Again, fill light adds a little light to my shadows, and so it helps with even with tonal separation in the deeper shadows really, really nicely, especially when you print. I've dropped the brightness from 50 down to 25. And that, again, was to redistribute my midtones so that I can really get more richness into the colors and into the areas that have a lot of midtones. Contrast, I boosted up to 31 from 25. Just wanted to bring out a little more contrast. The rest I'll do with the tone curve, which gives me much more control. And clarity I have at 35, between 35 and 40. Local contrast, again, does a beautiful job with this image. We have lots of contrast in the foreground with these great rocks, and again, a lot of contrast in the sky that can benefit from clarity. So we'll set that at 40. Vibrance and saturation, again, we're converting to black and white. So speaking of that, let's hit the V key, and that converts our image to black and white. Now, when we convert to black and white in Lightroom, there is our black and white panel, and we'll go there now. Lightroom does a decent job of giving us an auto mix of our colors for black and white. So again, each of these sliders controls the brightness or darkness of these colors as they originally were in the image. So wherever we had red in the image, we can now control its brightness and darkness. So this means that we have a lot of control over our black and white tonality. And let's step back for a minute and just talk quickly about composition and what I want to do with this image, what I want to say, what my sort of my creative outlook is. Here, I really want to emphasize this leading line from the bottom left. That's kind of the idea of how the eye should move through this image. Strong diagonal line with a repetition of these three rocks in the foreground, and then it continues up around the right and then out into this landform. And what I want to do is I want to try to use the sky as a way to create a lot of drama and a dynamic sense of movement and rhythm so that the eye keeps moving around and keeps circling around these areas. So how do we do that? Well, one way to do that is with tonality. And so I really want to darken the sky down because I know that's how it felt when I was in the scene there. And it had certainly had an emotional impact on me. And so I want to bring that out. So the way we can do that is I'm going to drag the blue slider down. And you can see how that darkens down the areas in the image that had blue to begin with. Okay, so that creates a much better sense here of depth and, again, this rhythm that I mentioned before. Reds, I think I had boosted the reds just a bit. That helps with separating some of the tones in the rocks, in the foreground rocks. And I think I also moved the yellows. There's a little spot right here that had quite a bit of yellow. And so you can see moving the yellow kind of brings that out. And again, these are all very subtle details, but this area here of high contrast helps to keep the eye, to keep pushing the eye up and around. The other area that I wanted to mention quickly is back here. We have kind of three areas here of tonality. You don't see them now, but I know that in the original scene we had these dark pines, we had this green vegetation growing on the rocks, and then the rocks themselves. And I want more separation here. So I can do that by using the green slider and boosting the green slider up. And you can see how that helps to separate and create just a subtle tonal variation here, which I think is pleasing to the eye. I kind of knew this was green, but you can also use the target adjustment tool. You select that here, and then you can click and drag in the image, and it kind of automatically selects the color for you. So that's kind of a nice, a very nice, powerful feature of the black and white controls in Lightroom. All right, that's it for my black and white mix panel. Next, I'm going to go to the tone curve. And on the tone curve, I'm going to turn the tone curve on, zoom out, and turning the tone curve, I'm going to turn it off again so we can see what it did to the whole image, then turning it on again. Okay, And you can see here, I basically started with a standard S-curve, which is what we get when we select the medium contrast preset for the point curve. And then I added an additional point very deep down here in the shadows, and that helps to protect this tonality here. So you see without this point curve, again, we lose that separation that I tried to create before with the mix slider. So by placing a point here, I'm able to protect this a bit, but I can still get this S-curve, which is creating nice contrast in my midtones. And I think I darkened down my blacks just a bit as well to, again, just get more richness in my deep shadows. So that was basically it for the point curve. Again, very powerful in being able to control your deep shadows, which is very important in a black and white image. Okay, moving on from the point curve, we have split toning. I did apply some toning, but I'm going to skip that for now because split toning is something I like to add towards the end, sort of the icing on the cake or the finishing touch. And so we'll see how that works at the end. Detail, turn that detail panel on. And we do have some basic settings here. Amount, sharpening 75, radius 1.0. You could argue that I could use a lower radius because I have a lot of high frequency detail, but I also have a lot of sky and ocean, which I don't want to overemphasize. And so 1.0 works fine in terms of radius. I did boost the detail slider up around 50, and this just sort of helps to bring out more detail in the areas that I'm sharpening. And then masking I have set to 20. If I hold down my Option key and drag the masking control by pressing my mouse button and holding down the mouse button, you can see how the areas that I'm masking, areas that convert or turn to black, are areas that are being protected from the sharpening, and areas that remain white are being sharpened. And so you can see how I'm basically protecting the sky and the ocean from a lot of sharpening, but I am getting most of the sharpening applied to the rocks and the foreground elements here and the landforms in the distance. Noise reduction, plus 20, plus 21. Color noise reduction we don't need. Again, we're working in black and white. I could even drop this to 10. The noise reduction in Lightroom is so good that just applying 10 or 15 is not going to do any damage to your image, and can potentially just clean up any area where you may have some noise. And so between 10 and 20 is kind of a nice default. Okay, so that's it for my detail slider. Moving down to lens corrections, let's turn those on. And boy, that does a nice job of straightening up my horizon and opening up my edges. Again, the lens correction protects, or not protects, but it helps to make up for vignetting from my lens, and so that's kind of nice. You can see how it opened it up really nice here, and on all of the corners. Okay, next we're going to move to the local adjustments, which is where a lot of the work was done to really finalize this image. I think for me that's where the real magic happens in terms of creating something that's expressive. And so let's see what I did there. First, the brush tool. Let's turn on the adjustments panel, and now you can see the various brushes that I used. So starting in the top left, I have this one brush here that I basically use to burn down those highlights, okay, in the sky. Just wanted to burn these little highlights down a bit. Of course, I mentioned before this highlight here in the sky. So this has one main brush, which I use to darken that down by a half stop. And then I have another brush that I think I use as kind of a global dodging brush, or I'm sorry, as a burning brush. So you can see how I burn down the sky some more, and then some other areas that I selectively used to burn down. Back here, trying to create more separation between these landforms, darkening down the ocean a bit, probably so that this rock, this diagonal, is stronger and has a little more contrast to it. It makes it more apparent. And I also darken down some of these areas here in the foreground rocks. And again, just working creatively in a way that helps to increase a sense of depth and dynamic a dynamic sense of the image and helps with these leading lines. Again, we talked about how I wanted the eye to move up, and you can see how I'm creating that. I have another brush here, which is my dodging brush, and here you can very specifically, very easily see how I'm working with leading the eye. I'm brightening up these areas that I felt were too dark so that they sort of sit and feel better in terms of their balance with the areas that are around them, the surrounding areas. So I brighten up these rocks over here, more rocks here, and just kind of leading around so that, again, creating leading lines and a way to really lead the viewer without question as to what I want them to see. And then finally, I used a graduated filter, which is this one here. Let's go back to the brush and turn, okay, there we go, turn off that the overlay. Graduated filter, and this one was created just to kind of darken down the sky overall, just to create a little bit more drama. Again, when you create a filter, everything above the filter is what is going to be affected. At least in this case, that's what I wanted. I wanted everything above to be to have this effect applied, and everything below not to be affected. And of course, the width of this graduated filter controls how quickly we go from the effect to no effect, or our transition. And I've used a combination of exposure and brightness. Exposure dropping down the brightest parts of the sky, and then once I was happy with that, then I used brightness to drop down the midtones and the other areas without affecting that bright area. So exposure controls your whites or your brightest area, and then brightness controls everything in between, your kind of your midtones. And I also added quite a bit of clarity to this filter as well. So that means that from here up, I'm adding plus 40 clarity, and that really helps to make these clouds even more expressive and make these just make them more of a factor in the image. All right, finally split toning. I'll turn that on, and I think I've just added a little bit of warming to the highlights. You can see how that adds kind of a really nice warm glow to it. I'm using hue of 49 and saturation of 8, kind of standard settings. Your warm sepia hues are going to be anywhere from 40 to 60, so I've gone ahead and used the 49 here. All right, and effects would be if I wanted to add some vignetting. In this case, I do not want to darken down the edges because I don't really want to center my viewer's eye into the center. I really want them to get a sense of the whole scene from all corners. This is kind of dark down here. I'm hoping that that balances with the brighter area in the sky. And again, we have these lines coming in here that I'm hoping balance out with these lines, and just create a really nice rhythm here and a sense of the mood, the drama, the amazing beauty that exists in this part of the world, and the energy, the energy of the ocean combined with the sky, weather, Mother Nature. These are all the things that I had in mind and I wanted to try to capture in this image. All right, so let's look at my final snapshot, see how close I got. And yeah, that's basically where it should be. So this is my final. Let's look at the import. All right, and then we'll look at the final. And we press the L key twice for lights out, and that's our final. All right, so I hope that's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed this Lightroom tutorial. Take care.